the biggest kind of impact has been on BESS projects, so battery energy storage projects. The CP2030 buckets for those projects were quite small compared to the queue sizes. And even with the target buckets of like around 28 gigawatts, the way queue ordering is done, they've allowed for projects that have obtained planning consents. Those projects are termed as protected. And with those protected projects, the BESS queue reaches around 90 gigawatts. So it kind of like triples the intended capacity bucket sizes already.
Hi, I'm Toby from Blake Clough Consulting, and I'm here with Siddharth and Chanel today to talk a little bit about the Clean Power 2030 process, the ongoing grid reform, which is a process that's been drawn out for a little while now that Blake Clough have been working closely on, and also to talk about how Blake Clough have helped developers up until now and how we plan to help the developers going forwards as much as we can, as well as engaging with the system operators. So to kick us off, I think we should talk a little bit about the background of Clean Power 2030, why the process came about, and a high-level view of what's happened up until now.
Okay, so CP2030 was created in an effort to decarbonize energy generation by 2030, actually 95% by 2030 and the rest extending to 2035. And it is part of the overall grid reform that are happening across GB. And they created basically, NISO created zonal capacity buckets split by region, technology, and also network, whether it's distribution or transmission.
We want to move towards a greener grid, which is low carbon, and also try to manage the queue size of that greener grid, because with the previous regime of you kind of first come, first serve, the connections queue in GB had grown to like a really massive level. And that kind of implementing that level of build out was not feasible or practicable by 2030 or by 2035. And it was triggering a lot of transmission reinforcement works, a lot of new GSPs. So this kind of PMO4 plus queue reforms came about as a way to manage that queue and to prioritize projects that are more advanced and demonstrate that they're more advanced.
Cool. So you both touched on the fact that pre-TMO4 plus the queue was really large and it was kind of like a first come, first serve process. How has it looked for individual developers who were sat in that previous queue? What processes have they had to do and what did they have to prove to enable themselves to be in the correct position in the new reformed queue?
Before that, it was first come, first serve, and it was ordered depending on the application date. So now with CP 2030, it depends, like the queue position is dependent on whether they met the abundance criteria. So if they hold land rights, and also it depends on their planning status, if they have planning submitted or planning accepted. So that plays into its queue position in the
reform queue.
The reform queue.
Maybe we can touch a little bit on the impacts that's had on the reformed queue, because as of recently, we now have the results or the Gate 2, Gate 1 outcomes for individual projects. And Blake Clough have been able to do some analysis on these outcomes. We were also providing analysis for projects in the queue beforehand to kind of predict where they would end up in the new queue, and you were closely involved in that, Siddharth. But what results and what outcomes have we found across GB for projects? Which types of projects and which locations have done well and which have kind of suffered or moved back in the queue because of CP 2030?
Yeah, I think in general, the biggest kind of impact has been on BESS projects, so battery energy storage projects. The reason for that is that the CP 2030 buckets for those projects were quite small compared to the queue sizes. So the actual bucket sizes are only around like 28.7 gigawatts for or like something around that number of 2035. And it was like 100 gigawatt plus queue, essentially. And even with the target buckets of like around 28 gigawatts, the way queue ordering is done, they've allowed for projects that have obtained planning consents before the closure of the CMP 435 window, given that they would have had to apply for planning before 20th of December 2024. Those projects are termed as protected. And with those protected projects, the best queue reaches around 90 gigawatts. So it kind of like triples the intended capacity bucket sizes already. What that means is that a lot of best projects that had just submitted planning right after that cutoff date, or we're going to go into planning, the kind of opportunities for them to develop a standalone BESS itself are not too bright for the near future. Obviously, these targets are going to be revised with the introduction of the Strategic Spatial Energy Plan. But yeah, by the current outcomes of the Gate 2 reforms, a lot of those projects would be getting Gate 1 offers, which is essentially just saying that we know that you exist, but you don't really hold a connection like date or a point of connection currently.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. And especially if we have developers that have co-located sites, like for instance, solar and BESS. In many cases, the BESS has received a Gate 1 offer and the solar has received a Gate 2 offer. So they were affected by that, and they had to like find ways to maybe like drop away the BESS or find ways to get a Gate 2 offer in like the next application windows. So
and then maintain the feasibility of the project when you've lost half of the technology states.
Which is quite hard because you lose on like the revenue stacking opportunities that could have maybe pushed your project as viable, but now that option is gone. So you're kind of having to rethink and redesign your operational philosophy.
And this is what we do here in Blake Clough. We help them to find ways, and we recommend what to do in that case.
So we touched a bit on co-located projects, particularly co-located solar and BESS. We haven't spoken about onshore wind. What were the results, the outcomes for onshore wind across distribution and also transmission?
Yeah, so for onshore wind, the onshore wind buckets were almost met. Essentially, what happened was that in Scotland, there was a massive, again, oversubscription of projects. So it was just protected projects being able to meet that onshore wind target in Scotland itself. In England and Wales, there is an undersupply. So there's opportunities for developers to develop greenfield onshore wind projects within England and Wales and potentially obtain a Gate 2 offer in the future. I think the number is around 4.1 gigawatts or so.
Is that England and Wales?
Of undersupply in England and Wales, yeah.
And is it possible that the targets for onshore wind could change in the SSEP as well?
Yeah, I think with SSEP, so the view that we have internally is that there's a lot of demand growth that is expected to be put onto the network just because of the way data centers are gaining traction. And that means that we would need some of these low carbon generation sources, like the buckets for those to be increased to meet that new additional demand. The initial outcomes of SSEP, for which they've only done the economic modeling so far, has indicated that their kind of whatever zonal modeling really prefers onshore wind build out compared to offshore wind, just because it's much more cheaper to do. And it's the same for solar as well. So solar, I think they ran a bunch of different scenarios when they were doing the economic modeling, and it turned out that solar was preferred to, like a maximum build out of solar was preferred in each of those scenarios, given the way costs are going for solar development, essentially. But yeah, those are just initial results, and we're yet to see how that aligns with the geospatial modeling that they're also doing and what the final buckets are going to be as a result of both of those aspects of the SSEP.
That's really interesting. And I didn't really know much about this SSEP process, but it sounds like NESO have a tricky task of optimizing the capacities of all three technologies alongside each other. But considering maybe from an operational perspective, how easy it would be to operate the network when there's the given penetration of these different technologies. And I think a network that's entirely based on solar is going to struggle to be dispatched at nighttime. And obviously we have like a strong pipeline of offshore wind due in the next 10 years, but it really is a whole system problem that's being tackled by NESO.
And I think they're going to consider that when they do their kind of geospatial analysis. And obviously, like, there's also within that geospatial analysis, they'd also have to include kind of regional constraints and stuff. So like across the Scottish English boundary, for example, and like those kind of existing network constraints. So hopefully that comes through, and the capacity buckets that are produced as a final result take into account all of those different factors.
Yes, and speaking of that and the expected increase of demand and SSCP, and our in-house modeling that we do with our clients to help them scout for capacity, especially for new sites, we also model the different scenarios where we incorporate this demand growth to help them have an idea of what would the headroom look like in those specific scenarios with the demand increase.
So is that capacity scouting, for demand applications or for new generation?
They're mainly for generation. So we help them whether it's wind, solar, or BESS. We add those scenarios to help them understand whether the different transmission or distribution zones are oversubscribed or not, and if they would be attractive zones to have the plant there in that specific zone.
Yeah, I think we take a very CP2030 informed approach towards capacity scouting, in which we, as like Chanel was saying, we initially look at the level of competition in each of the underlying distribution transmission zones based on the CP2030 buckets and the queue sizes in those regions. And based on that level of competition relative to the queue sizes, we do a bit of like modeling around how would data center growth within the zone, or like within GB, how would that impact the bucket sizes of that particular zone, and try to see what the potential bucket size increase could be and how that impacts which projects could potentially, or like the percentage of projects that could potentially get a gate 2 offer in the future. And we feed that down into our further more granular analysis, where we look at the headroom available at GSPs and substations, and then further at primaries and BSPs. So it's kind of like a trickle-down CP2030 approach.
That makes sense. That's very, very clever way of approaching it. Okay, that brings us to the end of the discussion. Thanks, Chanel and Siddharth, for your contributions. If anything that we discussed today interests you, or you want to find out more, please get in touch with either one of the panel or our info address email available on the website, and we'll be happy to help.